and welcome to Transforming Language Education, the vodcast series where we will talk about the future of teaching, inquiry, and advocacy in language education. I'm Jen Crawford.
And I'm Rob Philback. Please like or subscribe if you want to join us in helping to transform language education. All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Today on the show, we're excited to have Christian Chun, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. We're excited to have Christian here for our second of 3 episodes, and this one's going to be focused on what do we mean by critical pedagogy in the ESL classroom?
Yeah, and Christian, maybe we can begin by refreshing for listeners. What is the notion of critical pedagogy in simple terms? What are we talking about, especially in reference to the language classroom?
Right. Well, as you know, the original work on critical pedagogy was initiated and led by Paulo Freire, and within the context of the language classroom, it has slowly been developing, but it's around this idea around how we can question in one domain, question the materials in textbooks. So how particular textbooks are presenting of a particular people and their identities, how we would not take that for granted, but to question them. And so one of the articles that I wrote that was back in 2009, which was addressing on how, again, this kind of particular representations of an ethnic group was presented in a particular way, and that this was not always going to, not only in terms of that, where students might feel disconnection from, but importantly, that it would again foster this disengagement with material, because if it's standardized in a way that it is not only, I use the word bland, but that it is also harmful, that students would have a very, understandably so affective reaction to it. In other words, if, literally kind of like drawing back from it, and then thus, disengaging them from the work. So from their schoolwork. So I think this is important where teachers, when they see these types of things in their textbooks, to raise these issues with the students, just perhaps leading off with a question of like, well, what do you think about this representation? And again, to counter some accusations, it is not propaganda. It is really literally just questioning things that we see and hear in front of us.
So when we think about the classrooms, in many cases, our teachers might actually have a curriculum that is fixed or that's been mandated. In other cases, they may get to make choices about what they teach. But even in that context, I'm thinking there still oftentimes is sort of an implied curriculum or a set curriculum, even based on the field and the values that the field, broadly speaking, places in terms of how language ought to be taught. I'm just wondering, why is that? Like, who gets to make these choices about what is the dominant thing to talk about, or what's the dominant discourses in our classrooms? In other words, it just seems like there is this kind of this thing there, and a lot of assumptions around what we all ought to be teaching. Kind of how does that happen?
Well, that's an important question. And recently, a number of scholars in both applied linguistics and TESOL have been addressing this from primarily what has been called the racial linguistic perspective. Scholars like Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores, building on works of people like Ophelia Garcia. It's where, questioning on how the mandated curriculum, and again, as in terms of critical pedagogy, really looking it through the lens of, well, to what extent is this perpetuating a hierarchy of a system in which particular groups of people are placed at the top and other groups of people have been placed at the bottom. And accompanying that, of course, is with language and how, and we've all been complicit in this, whether we want to or not. But again, this is the feeling of the pressure that's on us of teaching a standardized English in which that other Englishes and other languages are literally denigrated, dismissed, not seen as correct, and where one form of a standardized English is vaunted as the only real English, so to speak. And I think this is something, again, that's tied into the curriculum. And as going back to the other part of your question, whether it's at the state level, the local district level. But I think, again, this is something where, as educators, we need to have these, whenever it's possible, conversations with the people who are administrating and mandating these curriculum.
Yeah, it makes me think of a question I've heard from a lot of my students, whether they're reviewing like those 5 tenets of ratio-linguistic theory from Flores and Rosa, or Rosa and Flores, or if they're thinking about some of the tenets of critical pedagogy. A lot of times they'll say, this sounds really nice in the abstract. This is beautiful theory. And so I find that one of our challenges is to figure out ways to make this seem applicable to our teachers, something that is doable in multiple contexts, because oftentimes people say, well, I'm not sure what this means in terms of how I augment the textbook I'm using. I'm not sure what this means in the context of teaching EAP in a university in China, or I'm not sure what this means. You fill in the context with the set of institutional constraints. So I wonder if you have any suggestions for teachers about how we might be able to support students to interrogate structures of power around race, class, gender in conversations and in their language use, as well as seeing their language use as some sort of form of social action around some of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I think, there are on so many fronts, and part of that is to foster and find ways in which to engage local communities, and particularly local community centers in which languages are taught. And that there are teachers who have not been exposed to these, relatively recent concepts and theories. Perhaps teachers have been teaching for several decades now, and have not had time, of course, to read up on the recent literature. And so they may not always be aware of this. But I think in terms of recent graduates or teachers who have been able to have access to this material, this literature, to find ways in which to work with other teachers in local community contexts with that. And it's also, the idea around how we also thinking about how we might, when, for example, when we grade papers, for example, the ways in which we might be judging, okay, are their written forms adequate enough? Is in terms of okay, they're conveying important ideas, but is it written in a particular register of what is seen as, again, standardized academic English, or where they're trying to communicate in ways that are going outside of that. So I think that's an important part where teachers would be thinking about that with their students, but also trying to work with other teachers in terms of this.
Christian, I was wondering too if this idea of countering, practically taking steps to counter narratives that may show up in the curriculum. I know you wrote a little bit about in a 219 article on an EAP context where students worked on co-constructing alternative narratives about Islam and democracy. I just wonder, if there's a takeaway there, an application from that example that helps to kind of illuminate this idea that we're talking about.
Yeah, and again, I think this is something where again, with the critical pedagogy, where, the first step is to, and I understand this is not to, shame or blame teachers who are a bit, feel inhibited or even intimidated by introducing these topics that can cause debate. But I think this is important where that teacher did address this notion around representations of Islam in the mass media in the context of North America, but also in terms of how that article showed, it literally opened up the doors of how the students would be offering alternative narratives. So I think, again, where this is important that we, and that's been, part of the, around the legacy and the, approaches of critical pedagogy is to move us out of our so-called, comfort zone, and that we, address these things. And very often, I mean, as I would argue and others, that it has had very positive impacts, because it actually, students, are not, have not really experienced those spaces in their classrooms before. So when they have that opportunity, they jump at it, because it's like, wow, okay, I could actually start talking about something that my other teachers have never talked about before.
I love that idea, and it makes me think about some of the things you spoke about in earlier episodes, connecting to critical pedagogy and some of Paulo Freire's work, where he's arguing that teaching for democracy is a practice of democracy that really is most effective when it involves direct and active participation and deliberation in social and political life. So I'm wondering, for teachers who are excited about that idea, how can they foster that? How can they do this? How can they have this democratic classroom? How can they sort of foster critical awareness and support social action and engagement in political life in the language classroom generally, and maybe even specifically for students who have novice language proficiencies? Right.
That's an important question. I think, I think a major component would be the emotional atmosphere of the classroom that is co-constructed with both the students and the teachers. But I think it's on our side as educators, our roles of educators. And again, this goes back to teacher identities, on how we actually present ourselves to the students in the classroom that we may not always be aware of. But if, when we come into the classroom, and, students, if it's the first day of class and the students have never had you as a teacher before, I mean, I'm sure all of us remember back in the day when we were students, when we had a new teacher, we would always be like, okay, who is this person? What kind of teacher are they going to be? Right. And then we quickly found out. And again, it's part of feeling, students feeling comfortable to express dissenting opinions. And so that the teacher's not going to be saying, no, you're wrong, I'm right. And where, if a student says something that actually might be technically wrong in terms of whatever, the teacher would not call them out blatantly and just say, that's interesting. Well, perhaps maybe thinking about it this way. And so that does make the students feel comfortable in expressing themselves, again, in which they may feel inhibited to not do that. But it's also, I think, important where the teachers present to the students their own self-reflexivities around language. So when they are in the context of, for example, in this country, if they're teaching English language, where where I've done this in the past, where I've shared with the students of okay, yes, I was born in this country, I grew up in an English-speaking home, went to college, blah, 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 but my English is not always, quote unquote, perfect. Sometimes I've made grammatical mistakes, like all of us have. And so, if you're making a mistake in English, don't worry about it, because no one is we all make mistakes with language. I mean, that's part of it. So I think that's, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was really helpful, and I really appreciate your work and the conversation. during this episode in clarifying what is critical pedagogy and how it connects to language education and English language education, particularly in North America. It was incredibly inspiring. Thank you. I'm Jen, this is Rob, and we're with Christian. Thank you so much, and we look forward to our next episode.